There's a few more faces out there this week than there was last. We're making progress, I suppose, eking our way back to where everybody's feeling better and can break free from the confines of their home. We're mindful of a number of our folks who aren't feeling well right now and who have chronic illnesses also, but we want to make sure that we recognize them and do what we can to help them. But it's sure good to see that hopefully we're going to be coming out of it. Some years ago, I remember we said, and of course this is not all about that disease, which we cannot discuss, but there's other stuff going around too. But we once said not too long ago, several years ago now, I guess a couple of years ago, that before it's all over, everybody's going to get it. So we may be in that phase right now, but thankfully it's not as severe as what it was early on, so that's good for everybody. Anyway, welcome, and certainly to our visitors. We want you to know how honored we are that you're here with us this morning. A number of our members, as you've already gathered, are missing, and our group is smaller as a result, so you're an encouragement to us by being here. We hope likewise that we can be an encouragement to you. This morning, Cody kindly read a couple of verses out of Mark chapter 5. If you'll recall, that is the story of Jairus' daughter there and her illness. And there's a number of other components to that story, but obviously there in verse 35 and 36 of Mark chapter 5, it sort of boils down to that very simple point. Do not be afraid any longer, only believe, is what Jesus said there. If you'll allow me the liberty to tell a personal story to kind of start off some years ago, and there's several of you in the room who can relate to this, I know, and several of our brothers have served in the military and sisters too, and so you have some knowledge of this. But some years ago I was serving as a rappel master and rap master, and we were doing air assaults and whatnot, and there was an individual that was we were in a Huey helicopter, and individual had rigged up and cinched down on the donut. I was the rap master, so I'm back at the back of the crew cabin there at the gunner's mic, and I'm giving instructions as to how to step out on the skid and drop out and all of that. And there was one individual that everything looked to be good until we just got right up to the end. And several of you in the room have seen this before, where you get right up to the first step and you look into the person's eyes. Can't hear, obviously, unless they're wearing an intercom, but you look right into the person's eyes and they look like saucers of milk. They're this big around, and the mouth is open, and you can see there is nothing going on behind the eyes, just frozen in time, afraid to step off, afraid to step back on, just caught up. So I did what all honorable rap masters do, and I pushed him out of the door, and he ended up ricocheting off the skid on the way down. And anyway, he made it fine, because there's people on the ground, service safety, they're holding the rope and belaying, it's called, to keep him from hyper accelerating down the rope. And so anyway, we got him through it. When it was all over with, he came up to me and he asked me, he said, "What did I do wrong?" And I said, "Well, you just did what a lot of people do." I said, "You didn't trust your gear." That's one of the main things about doing something, is that there's a point where you have to trust the system. Now, we don't want to be foolhardy in that regard, but when you're doing helicopter rappel, you need to trust the rope. You need to trust your gear to a certain degree. If you don't, you're always going to be second guessing what you do. You're going to hesitate. And you've got competent people, theoretically, who have rigged that for you. We've got good trained folks who are backing you up and taking care of you. And at some point in time, it's time to do your job. Everybody else has done theirs. It's time for you to do yours. And so the rappel begins. At a point in time, we all have to no longer fear just believe. Because fear is something that will cause us to be absolutely paralyzed. And paralysis is not good in any world, certainly not in the spiritual world that we discuss this morning. So biblical fear, as we read about fear in the Bible, it's just like any other fear that we see in our lives. But fear causes us to be paralyzed. And I have commonly said in my experience, and certainly I know in yours, that nothing worthwhile ever happens in the company of cowardice. If we are afraid and if we are anxious, then by virtue of that, we tend to be very reluctant to step out onto the rope and do what our job is to do. The word in the Bible, phobos, which should hearken in your mind the idea of a phobia. Phobia, same Greek root, phobos. Phobos is a word that can mean an appropriate submissiveness, like fear of God. So it has a couple of different meanings. It can be subject in all fear to your masters, 1 Peter chapter 1. So it can mean that a healthy respect, a thing that will cause you to do what you should be doing. Work out your salvation in fear and trembling, as Paul says in Philippians chapter 2, that those are all the kinds of fears that we ought to have. We ought to have the appropriate fear that would cause us to, and usually that reference, we're talking about a respect, admiration, and an adherence to the will of God. That kind of fear is good. We want that kind of fear. This is the kind of thing that we need to have, is a healthy fear and respect for God that would cause us to be obedient to Him in all of His ways. But there is a bad kind of fear, the kind of fear that we read of, for example, alluded to in 1 John chapter 4 and verse 18, where it says there is no fear in love. We don't want that we don't want the fear that would cause us not to love someone or something in the way in which God intends. Fear is a prohibitor from performance. Fear causes us not to do as we are instructed to do, but instead as we might prefer to do in order to preserve ourselves. That's a form of selfishness and pride. So fear, the kind that God expects us to have, that's a good thing. But the kind of fear that would prohibit us from doing as God expects, the kind of fear that would paralyze us from being what we should be, that would create in us anxiety and frustration and a self-preservationist sort of perspective of life, that's unhealthy, and it is not what God intends. So let's look a little closer at Mark chapter 5 and pick up some of the context here. And thanks to Cody for already reading that one or two verses, but I want to go back and pick it up a little bit more. Here beginning in verse 21 of Mark chapter 5. It said, "And when Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered about him, and he stayed by the seashore. And one of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and upon seeing him fell at his feet, and entreated him earnestly, saying, 'My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, that she may get well and live.' And he went off with him, and a great multitude was following him and pressing in on him." Verse 25, "And a woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years, and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse," grown worse, after hearing about Jesus, came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, "If I could just touch his garments, I'll get well." And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And immediately Jesus perceived in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd, and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?' And he looked around to see the woman who had done this, but the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, 'Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed in your affliction.' While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, 'Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?' But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, 'Do not be afraid any longer, only believe.' And he allowed no one to follow with him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the synagogue official, and he beheld a commotion, and people were loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, 'Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep.' They began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, 'Talitha cum,' which translated means, 'Little girl, I say to you, arise.' Immediately the girl rose and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded, and he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and that something should be given to her to eat." Jairus was a man of prominence. He was a man of responsibility, and he had a role there. And approaching him to beg Jesus to save his daughter's life illustrated his fear of losing the one he loved. It was all the more poignant knowing that there was a timeline, at least in Jairus' mind. We needed to hasten to be there to help my little daughter, his words. We know from the Luke account that this was in fact his only daughter. And so this is a very poignant and very difficult circumstance for Jairus. And he desperately wanted solution to this because he feared so much for the loss of his daughter, something we could all understand and certainly have sympathy for. Jesus was compassionate, you recall back in verse 24, and he left immediately with him. It says, and he went off with him, and a great multitude followed him, there in verse 24. But he was slowed by the encounter with this woman who had this hemorrhage. And so Jesus takes the time here to stop, and he's dealing with a multitude of people. This woman touches him. There is a whole other lesson to be learned, or more to be learned from that. But as a result, the delay served to make them not arrive before the young girl had died. The Bible tells us that, in Jesus' own words, that she had not died but had fallen asleep. Well, the truth is that is an idiom, that is a language mechanism to illustrate a difference in perspective between God and the deity, which was Jesus, his Jesus, and our human perceptions on things. The little girl had most certainly lost her physical life, but to Jesus it was no more than merely having to wake her up. That's the difference in perspective here, the difference in understanding between life and death. For us, death is permanent. For God, death is defeated. Not only was it defeated in the case of this little girl, but Jesus is the very personification of the defeat of death. We know that he defeated death. That's a biblical language describing his experience of sacrifice, crucifixion, his being in the grave for 3 days and then rising from the dead. He defeated death. Here he defeated death. And it's a simple process in the hands of Jesus and his Father. So one of the lessons we come from here is that things that seem so bad to us, we're looking at it from human perspective. We're looking through the little pinhole, which is all that's been revealed unto us. And so you and I fret and fear over things that really maybe are in part due to a wrong perspective. The difficulty that we endure, the trouble that we bear, the things that happen to us today, the here and the now, these are temporal things. And yes, they're hard to endure, and difficult and painful and exhausting. And they wrangle from us the worst of our emotions, and they cause us trepidation and fear. All of these things, however, are human perspectives. Because the truth is, we know that we are here but for a little while. Our life is but a vapor. We are here but for a little while, and then we vanish away. This is not our home. This world is not the definition of our existence. The difficulties that we endure and the pain that we feel and the issues that we confront are merely ripples in the pool of our lives, because our life is eternal. And I know that we live in the here and the now. We function in the here and the now, and the here and the now is very important. I get that. We have charge, biblical charge, to live our lives in certain ways here, to function in certain ways, to do and to love in certain ways, and to do God's will. I get that. I understand it's very important. I'm not saying it doesn't matter at all. The preacher of Ecclesiastes kind of, in his own mind, I think, went a bit too far, and he is corrected as a result of that, when he felt like that there's just no purpose at all in life. But we read, if we continue on in the book of Ecclesiastes, that what does matter is to love God and do His commandments. So there's great lessons to be learned, and I'm not impugning the writer of Ecclesiastes. I'm merely saying that perspective can be askew, and that is illustrated in Ecclesiastes. That you become enamored with things of the world, or you can think that there's absolutely no value in things of the world, or no value in living as you should on this earth. Then both are wrong. But here we see that this individual, very concerned about the loss of his daughter, was all consumed by that, as you can imagine anyone would be. But for Jesus, it was just as simple as she is merely asleep. So our perspective is not God's. We don't see things in the same way that He does. We don't understand life in the same way that He understands it. We don't understand anything in the same way that He does. And at some point in time, my friends, in our life, my life, and your life, sometimes we just have to trust the rope. We have to be prepared that someone else has done their job. Now it's time for us to do ours. The rigging is set. Circumstances all in place. Now it's time for us to go to work and do our job and trust that God did His. Because He has. And that gives us a great deal of perspective and a great deal of understanding, that to look beyond this and to look beyond this time and place gives us a lot of strength to endure a lot of things. Uriah's daughter, that situation was all-consuming to him, absolutely no doubt. But to Jesus, it really wasn't that complicated, was it? He was constrained. It took longer to get there than I'm sure Uriah wanted. But he got there none the same, and the work was to be done. And so that delay served to further prove another point. Not only does God see things differently than we do, but it also is one of those cases in point that proves the deity of Jesus Christ. He's not just a man who had come to earth, or a God who divested Himself of His deity and came to earth and was just like you and I in every regard. He was not that. He was fully man, but He was also fully God. And we see that, at least in our measurement, it'd be a lot more difficult to raise a person from the dead than it would be to heal them of a disease. But to Jesus, it wasn't any different. He actually took advantage of the opportunity to teach a more powerful point. And that was that nothing is out of reach of God. And that you and I have the responsibility, as did those gathered there on that day, to believe it. And there is an inverse proportional relationship here. If we have faith, we will not fear. But the inverse is true. If we fear, it shows we have not faith. In that moment, in that time, our faith is weak. The truth is, you and I are all fearful, are we not? I'll tell you, fear is real. It was real for that young man that was stepping out on the rope out of that Huey helicopter in 1979. He was fearful. And fear has a benefit. It causes respect. Fear in God causes respect for God. Fear of that context of a helicopter rappel on a windy Texas day also created respect for the gear and respect for caution and a determination to follow the rules and the regulations and to do this thing right, because there's a great deal that depends upon it. In the same way, what we see here in this case is that faith defeats fear. Confidence defeats fear. When I know that I am in good hands, I am much more willing to prosecute the agenda that is before me and to do the work that I have been given to do. Jesus' answer was straightforward. Do not be afraid, only believe. It's interesting that he allowed the believing to be present there in verse 37. If you look a little further, it says, and he allowed no one to follow with him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. So it's interesting that this was not a show and tell. This was not, it's something for us to learn from, but Jesus had in his mind here an absolute responsibility, an absolute role to play, and he was going to play it to the best that he could. In verse 40, they began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions and entered the room where the child was. This laughing here is an unusual word. In verse 40, the fourth word there, they began laughing, laughing being the word, is a Greek word that's used only in a couple of other places in the New Testament, and it literally means to ridicule. So this was not just an outpouring or disbelief. This was ridicule in this case. These people laughed at Jesus when he said, why make a commotion and weep? The child's not died but is asleep. Well, they knew that she was not just asleep physically, and it caused them to ridicule him. The truth is that by virtue of what he did, we know that only God can give life. Therefore, Jesus was God. We learn from this story and from others like it that faith defeats fear. There's nothing ever positive or ever good or healthy or spiritual or useful to man that happens in the presence of cowardice. Now understand, I'm not talking about fear alone. Everybody has fears. You have fears, I have fears, we're all afraid. That's not what I'm talking about. But when fear paralyzes us, it becomes cowardice. There is no place for spiritual cowardice in service of Christ. Service of God for certain, and we can see an example of that throughout the Bible. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 6 says, thus Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear. You see the role that fear has. The inverse of that is that if you have fear, then you won't do what is right. See? So Peter makes it clear. that you're a child of Sarah in that regard. You're an offspring of her, a spiritual offspring of her. If you do what is right without being frightened, it says, by any fear. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14 and 15. Since then the children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise also partook of the same, that through death he might render powerless him who had power of death, that is the devil. Verse 15. And might deliver those who through fear of death were subject to slavery all their lives. Speaking of the old Hebrews here, their fear of death made them slaves. They were so fearful that they were afraid to energetically, enthusiastically serve God. Romans chapter 8, verses 12 through 17. So then, brethren, we are under obligation, not to the flesh, to live according to the flesh. For if you are living according to the flesh, you must die. But if by the Spirit you are putting to death the deeds of the body, you will live. For all who are being led by the Spirit of God, these are the sons of God, and for you have not received a spirit of slavery, leading to fear again. So here we are again. Now Paul writes, as did the Hebrew writer, that fear is a type of slavery. You have not received, this again, verse 15 of Romans chapter 8. You have not received a spirit of slavery leading to fear again, but you have received a spirit of adoption as sons, by which we cry out, Abba, Father. The Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, heirs also, heirs of God, fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, in order that we may also be glorified in him. So in a way, fear, cowardice, form of slavery, constrains us, makes us so afraid to act that we become useless. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 and 6 says, For he himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I ever forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What shall man do to me? The idea of being energized, encouraged, strengthened, does a whole lot for our ability to see things in a proper light. It prepares us and equips us to be able to do the things that God expects. Acts chapter 18, verses 9 through 11. The Lord comes to Paul in a vision and says, Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking and do not be silent. For I am with you, and no man will attack you in order to harm you, for I have many people in this city. And that was in regard to Corinth, and if you'll recall, Paul stayed there with them for over a year and a half. But he was concerned and he was frightened. And the Lord said to him, Do not be afraid any longer, but go on speaking. You see, fear was causing Paul to be reticent. And that was not beneficial to the cause of Christ. But when Paul realized that he needed to trust the rope, he stayed in Corinth for a year and a half, and we know the rest of the story and the relationship he developed with those brethren, and the fact that Corinth was a very troubled local church that had lots of issues, and he worked with them for years thereafter by letter to reconcile people one to another and to do away with sinful conducts. You see, fear was an inhibitor, and courage was, in fact, the thing that enabled Paul to serve his role as had been defined. I have a few other verses that I just want to read. We won't comment much on them, but I compiled a list because they all have this, they touch me, I hope they do you. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7. For God has not given us a spirit of timidity, but of power and love and discipline. Love, discipline, and power, all in the exact same sentence. Philippians 4 and verse 6, be anxious for nothing but in everything. By prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. You're familiar with that verse, I know. It goes on to say in the next verse, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. You see, the thing is fear is an inhibitor. It smothers us, doesn't it? You put it aside, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, is within our reach. If you and I don't enjoy that peace, then why? The conclusion is inescapable, is it not? 1 John 4 and verse 18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear involves punishment, and the one who fears is not perfected in love. 1 John. We talked in class this morning about 1 John and about how God is love, and we abide in him, he in us. Psalm 56, third verse there, one of my favorite verses, simply says, when I am afraid, I will put my trust in you. Succinct way of making the point very effectively. Isaiah 41 and verse 10, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. Joshua 1 and 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not tremble or be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Proverbs 1 and 7, a little bit different use of the word fear, but I like this verse too. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. He says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. That's the kind of fear we're to have. Fear of the Lord that will be causing us to grow in knowledge. Be strong in Deuteronomy 31. Be strong and courageous again. That phrase or song we sing. It says much the same thing. Do not be afraid or tremble at them, for the Lord your God is the one who goes with you. He will not fail you or forsake you. How about Joshua and Caleb? Afraid to go into the promised land and take that land because, not Joshua and Caleb, the 12 that went in, saying that we're like grasshoppers to these people. Joshua and Caleb said, what do we have to fear? God is on our side. In 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul instructs that church there to be strong and act like men. Stand up. And by the way, that's not a gender-specific thing. That's a warrior thing. Be strong. Be courageous. You see, throughout the biblical record, we are challenged over and over again to be strong. Why? Because good things happen in the presence of courage. Bad things happen in the presence of cowardice. It is an inescapable conclusion. It applies physically in our lives and spiritually. A good friend of mine who serves as an elder in another congregation once was confronted by the other elders. There was an individual who was a member of that church who was a violent man. And this violent man had threatened other people, had assaulted other people, and had just been problematic and had been in and out of fellowship with this local church for a number of years. And a couple of the elders were talking to one of the other elders, this friend of mine, and they said, we need to go talk to this person, but I don't know how we're going to do it because he is a very violent and dangerous person, and he'd committed sin, and they said, maybe we just need to wash our hands of him and forget about it. And this good friend of mine stood up and said, what? And they said, he said, no, we're commanded as to how we deal with a brother in sin, regardless of what the sin is and regardless of who they are. And he said, you stay here if you want to, but I'm going to talk to him. And he went and he talked to the man, and the man crumbled like a house of cards, burst into tears, repented, came forward, and as far as we know, did a reasonable job of living faithfully. My understanding is he had some hiccups even after that. But unfortunately, he died shortly thereafter. This man did. This violent, angry, aggressive man died a short time later. But do you see the impact of that story? The cowardice that existed in some of those men would have allowed that guy potentially to die in a sinful condition. The courage of another gave him a hope. I don't know what the formal outcome was, but I do know that one man was courageous. And this was a real physical threat. I talked to him afterward and I said, I'm real proud of you for doing that. And he said, I've been whooped before. If I have to take a whooping to do what I'm supposed to do, I'll take a whooping. I thought, that is the kind of human being that God expects in his service. Some years ago, many of you may have been familiar with Dan Shipley. Dan was a gospel preacher for many years. And there was an individual that spoke up against him in a topical way about something, and Dan went to him and said, we need to work this out, hash it out, and they did, and it turned out to be a good thing. And a little bit later, this contentious man made a comment about Dan and said, well, he's a good preacher, but he folded in front of me, which was not accurate at all. And in that conversation, somebody said something about Dan, and whether or not he was courageous. They had no idea who Dan Shipley was. A lot of people didn't until after he had passed. Truth is, he was a Marine pilot in Korea, highly decorated, distinguished flying cross. There was no cowardice in that man whatsoever. But there was love, and he knew when to subordinate his frustrations just to try to do what God expected him to do. You see, that's sometimes courage is in controlling ourselves. Courage is in stepping up and saying, I will be what God expects me to be. I will restrain my lesser qualities. Paul comments in Romans about the two natures. And he talks about there are the things that I know I shouldn't do that I want to do, and things that I need to do that I don't want. And he talks about that conflict that exists, the carnal versus the spiritual difference that's within each of us. You see, that's courage. The courage is to stand flat-footed on what we know our own weaknesses are and subordinate those weaknesses to what God would have us to be. That's not fear. That's not cowardice. That's courage. Courage to confront ourselves. Courage to say, I need to improve here. I need to sharpen myself here. I need to be better here. I need to work diligently to have a better relationship with my brethren, with my family, with God. I need to pray more. I need to serve more. I need to do all these things more, because sometimes our biggest cowardice is in confronting ourselves. Not in confronting somebody else, but in confronting ourselves. It is a form of cowardice when we know we are wrong and we give ourselves a pass. We know we're not living the way God expects, and we say, that's good enough. I'm a good person. My heart's right. God knows my heart. Listen to me very carefully, my friends. God does know your heart better than you do. And if you and I are making excuses for ourselves, we are foolish to think God does not know it. We've got to be courageous in confronting ourselves. What do I need to do to be courageous in our lives? in my life? Going back to my example to begin this discussion, what must I do to trust the rope? God has done his job. It is incumbent upon us now to do ours. Don't fear, just believe. We all know what the biblical meaning of the word belief is. We know that we're not saying a mere mental acquiescence. We understand biblical belief means obedience. If we believe a thing, then we will do what it says. It has an effect. It is effective. It has an effect in our heart that manifests itself in fruit. Fruitless labors are cowardly. So what must we be to be right with God? So this morning, I'd like for you to leave here with a couple of things in mind. One is how fortunate and blessed we are to have a God that is true to his promises and who has told us, do not fear, I will be with you always. How wonderful is that we don't have to worry in eternity about the difficulties that we endure today. There is a time coming when none of this will matter anymore. And what a blessing that is if we can keep that perspective in our own mind. The other thing, though, that I would ask you to consider and leave maybe encouraged this morning, to know that we are not only capable of being cowardly in our dealings with others, but maybe more frighteningly and more honestly, we can be cowardly in our dealings with ourselves. We can be cowardly in confronting what we know is wrong about ourselves. We can be cowardly and reticent in correcting ourselves and holding ourselves accountable. That cowardice is paralysis. It causes us to never move forward and to never confront ourselves and be what God expects us to be. Let us be strong and courageous, not only in the way we confront the difficulties of this life, but the way we confront ourselves. And by doing that, we can be pleasing to God. With that, the lesson's yours. Thank you for your patience this morning and your presence. We hope and pray that you've been benefited by being here with us. But you may have determined that there is a correction that is needed in your life that needs to be in a public way. As a matter of tradition, we always offer an opportunity for people to respond publicly at the conclusion of each lesson. If that be your need, if you need the prayers of your brethren, you need to confess sin, you need to obey the gospel, or you just need some help bolstering your courage, we'd ask you to come forward this morning as we stand and sing the selected song.
Oh, to be like thee, blessed Redeemer, this is my constant longing and prayer. Gladly I'll forfeit all of earth's treasures, Jesus, thy perfect likeness to wear.